my first store was in Green Valley Parkway and Sunset,
Right.
which is just about 3/4 of a mile from Tamiyasu, Pecos.
Right.
And on that street, of course, everybody knows the Casa de Shenandoah.
Sure. Well, we lived right around the corner.
Well, Bob Goulet and Vera lived in the equestrian estates.
Right.
We spoke earlier of Ralph Engelstadt. He had that big house with 100 palm trees.
Right.
Nobody knew who lived there, and he had over $100,000 worth of palm trees brought in.
Oh my
100
goodness.
big palm.
And what about all the animals and even penguins that that he brought in?
Yeah.
And tell your story.
Wayne came over and gave us 2 peacocks.
Because he had so many.
He had so many. And at the time, we were raising Akitas, which the Japanese, they're like
We
really
bred them.
tough, aggressive dogs. We had 6 of them.
Wow.
And one night, unfortunately, they got under the cage and they ate the peacocks.
Oh.
And there wasn't a feather left. They just destroyed.
Wow.
So I was dreading, the telethon was coming up, and I knew Wayne always comes on in the last hour. There's a commercial break, and Wayne comes back to the orchestra and says, "Larry, how are the peacocks?" And I just looked at him. I said, "My dogs love them."
Awful.
That's hilarious. Well, I'm driving down Tamiyasu one day, and here comes Mike Tyson and built that big house 2 doors up from Wayne. If you drive by, you can kind of see through the gates. That was Mike Tyson's house when he had money. And he had a big tiger in the backseat of his Mercedes. And I'm just thinking,
They were just amazing days.
Who would drive around with a Bengal tiger in the backseat? Nobody's going to write you a ticket, I guess. You get close to the car.
You know, the 3 of you have these fantastic stories that need to be heard. They just bring so much joy about the history of this town and the heart of all of these wonderful performers here in this town. And it makes me think, are stories like this happening now? With the way that the city has changed so much, become so corporate, become so isolated, like you're saying, the gentleman staying in the mansion, nobody knows about it.
Mm-hmm.
This freedom of entertainment, it seems to be locked down into the corporate structure. And now, are these stories even possible?
Well, I would naturally say no, but our daughter went on the road. She worked at Sony, and then she worked for Sharon Osbourne, and then she ended up working for Kelly Rowland. Mm-hmm. And her and Beyonce would go out, and they did a world tour together, and they have just as many wonderful stories. It's just that we aren't privileged to them because it's a different generation. But I'm sure there's still some really good stories out there if somebody were to tell them.
I'll answer that in a different perspective. Yeah. Let's say there were 14 major showrooms on the Strip. Mm-hmm. Most of them were 600, 700 seats. So they were intimate. Even if you sat in the back, you were close enough to see the face. Mm-hmm. And there was a camaraderie of people that played those rooms. So it was not unusual at 2 a.m. for those people to meet at certain places, maybe not in public, but they really got together and they encouraged each other. It was very rare that I would go to a Tuesday night opening at the Sahara Hotel where they wouldn't, either during the show or before the show or at some point, take the spotlight. And it was usually the entertainer would stop halfway through the show and say, "Hey, we have some special guests."
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And they run the spotlight around the room. And there was always 8 or 10 really big stars, and maybe even one every once in a while, a superstar, that would show up. And I don't see that as much anymore because the rooms have gotten less intimate. If you go play the Coliseum at Caesars, it's 5,000 seats.
Yes.
And they're building this new Madison Square Garden, MSG
Oh,
sphere.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be, it's opening in, I think, late 2023. It's just going to be 20,000 seats, but all immersive.
Those places intimidate me. I don't want to be with that big a crowd. I loved the days when you were like almost could touch them.
Yes.
I would see Ray Charles and I literally could reach up and touch him and he would talk to us. I liked that better.
But the economics had a lot to do with that. When a star went on the road, as the stars do today, they play arenas. And Taylor Swift, having trouble getting tickets sold that far in advance. And it was not that intimacy. It was big. When they came to Vegas, though, and they were hired by one of the mobsters, hotel owners, that made a special deal with just them, they got paid equally well. Back then, it was actually more than what they could earn on the road. There's no other city in the world where an individual theater owner could afford to have an intimate group with a high-paid act.
Yes.
So now it's all arenas. Well, Las Vegas kind of learned the gig, man. So now you have the MGM Garden, and I think I did a post on my Facebook not long ago, if you ever saw it, and I was talking about the different arenas that have been built in Las Vegas in the past 3 or 4 to 5 years. And it's amazing, the number of seats. But because we lost that intimacy, I think we lost some of that connection between the entertainers that would come and sit in that room. Because now to be ushered into an auditorium and the security and the pain of it and all, nobody wants to go and be exposed to that.
Right.
Back when it was small and intimate, you'd go in the dressing room and kick back and come out and sit in a booth, casino booth, and they'd introduce you and it was a big thing. So I think that just the size of the rooms and the economics of how the acts get paid, Vegas was a place where they expected to come play to 600 people, and they got connected to everybody in that room. Right. And when you go to do the MGM Garden,
not the same. Yeah,
you're not connecting with. You can't even connect with the first 10 rows.
Can't even see them.
Yeah, it's just massive.
It's just a sea of.
And you talk about Wayne Newton. Wayne at one point thought he was Elvis. You remember that time when it was kind of weird. Elvis had died at 43. I think 77 Elvis died, and Wayne all of a sudden thought he was Elvis, and he was opening at it was originally the International for Elvis, and then it became the Las Vegas Hilton, as I remember it most of the time. Now it's the Westgate. But the first time Wayne opened his big show at the Hilton, they had lasers for the first time, and he did this thing where they'd play that 2001 Space Odyssey. And then it would go into that C.C. Ryder drum thing, and the audience would get into the curtain would go up. And here's Wayne in a white studded cape.
Oh, no.
And he's standing on top of a big staircase and they're playing him down to C.C. Ryder. And, he thought he was Elvis and, reincarnated. God. But he was one of the guys you talking about time in a show. He's one of the guys the hotels hated because he would take encore after encore. As long as people would clap, he would keep singing.
Oh, you are correct.
Yes.
You conducted and played with him?
I just know from Robert.
Yeah. Oof.
And stories going around.
Oh, yeah. Just, an amazing number. I took my mom and dad to see his show. And we sat in the booth, and it was comped in. And afterwards, we were going to go down to the old Elvis dressing room down, the big room down below the stage that they built for Elvis. And so after the show, it's really great. It was opening night. And I heard a few mistakes. And, I could tell he was upset at a few of the cues that got missed, So Mom and Dad and I were downstairs with about 6, 8 other people in that big dressing room. And it's taking forever for Wayne to get down there. And they kept saying, I don't know if you knew his bodyguard. His name was Bear, this big burly guy. And he said, Wayne's, he's cussing out the band. He's upset. He's really pissed upstairs. He says, but he'll be down in a little bit. Well, I got a phone call and I had to leave. So I left and I said, Mom and Dad, just thank him for the show and leave because he's tired, he's irritated, and he, just get out of his way. Mm-hmm. So I left. I went home, and I'm typing on this thing, and time's going by, and it's an hour. It's an hour and a half.
They're not home.
Mom and Dad aren't home, and I'm thinking, they got knocked in the head. Something happened to them, So I called down to the hotel, and I said, you have to ring the maitre d's booth, which they hate doing. And I got the maitre d' who knew me, and I said, listen, I left Mom and Dad in Wayne's dressing room, and I'm scared because I don't know where they're at. And he goes, relax. He says, they're having a great time. He says, as a matter of fact, Wayne invited him to the second show to sit in his booth. He had him stand up and send a bottle of champagne, and everybody wished him a happy 50th anniversary.
Cute.
And Mom came home; she was on cloud nine. That was her main.
She was the cutest thing. Oh my
God! The Midnight Idol, Mr. Vegas. I was upset when George Wallace.
Oh yes,
George Wallace
started using Mr. Las Vegas, and it kind of irritated me a little bit because that was Wayne's time.
That was his thing, yeah.
And he sang the national anthem at one of our ball games about 2 months ago, and he forgot some of the words and didn't hit some of the notes. And
you know what? We're getting older.
Yeah.
It happens.
But, he's still fun to go hear his stories.
I loved his horses.
Oh, my God,
remember he'd have big barbecues. Mm-hmm. Once a year, he'd invite everybody. He'd do it for different charities. Mm. And these most gorgeous animals. It was just breathtaking to watch them run.
He bought Elvis's jet, an early jet, and brought it and put it on the property there at Casa de Shenandoah. and got it prepared so that people could walk in, they'd have it glassed and you could see Elvis's jet. And they found mold in it.
Oh, no.
And they never let him open it to the public. So it's just sitting there.
Stuck with the jet. And the penguins. Remember he had penguins?
Oh, yeah.
Well, you have an Elvis story. Tell him your Elvis story.
I guess I can tell that now.
Yeah, it's been long enough.
It won't. Yeah, I put a show together for Susan Anton.
Love her.
And
you founded her.
Yes.
At 17 or something?
Taught her to sing, yes.
Right after her, she was first runner-up to Miss America.
Yeah.
And
Miss California.
Miss California, correct. Anyway, Elvis liked her. Mm-hmm. So she said, between shows, let's go over to Elvis's dressing room. And so I got to meet him briefly. Mm-hmm. And at one point, he sat down next to me, and he had a huge belt buckle with mementos on it. And he began to tell me the story of each one, why it was put there. And after that, we mingled, and I sat back down on the couch. He came over again about 20 minutes later and said, "Did I ever tell you about my belt?" Oh. And he proceeded to tell me the whole story, almost word for word again. And out of respect, I listened to the whole story again.
Well, did you ever meet Bobby Morris, the drummer?
Of course.
Yeah. Bobby was the oldest agent in town. He started his Bobby Morris agency and booked acts all over the country, lounge acts. And Bobby, by default, became Elvis's drummer and then his conductor and musical director the year that Elvis made his big comeback at the Las Vegas Hilton. And Bobby just died about 4 months ago. Yeah. He was 92 and still could. I tried to get him on America's Got Talent. He was, Downbeat magazine said that he was one of the top 10 drummers in history.
Really?
He wrote this thing called Drumology that Buddy Rich played. Buddy Rich doesn't read music.
Yeah.
So Bobby would play it, and then Buddy Rich would play it and learn it by sight. All of that. So, but Bobby was this amazing thing. I said, Bobby, this win this $1 million. Let's have some fun, get some publicity. I said, all you have to do is walk out on a walker, 90-year-old guy, sit down on the stool, drop a couple sticks, knock over the hi-hat stand. And then when you start, people are going to, start off kind of slow and people are going to go nuts, And he never really did that. But the Bobby Moore story with Elvis is when Elvis opened at the International Hotel, they built that hotel and it was off the strip. And it was built with mob money, of course. And they were trying, if you watch this Elvis movie that's out currently, you'll see a little of that history. But they needed a big act in that room.
That was a good movie.
Yeah, yes, that was a good movie. I really enjoyed it. They needed a big act to bring people that mile off the strip. And so Bobby had this song and he took it to Elvis and he says, I have this song that I really think is great and I think you'll like it. He handed it to the piano player and Elvis sang through this song one time and he says, I really like that song too. And the night he opened, he debuted that song and it became one of his most famous, Suspicious Minds.
Wow.
Oh my goodness.
I'm caught in a trap.
Sure.
That your whole thing.
I know it well.
Yeah,
sure.
so it was kind of Bobby was responsible for getting that song on the charts, and Bobby was just an amazing musician. But back then, they everybody in that band, even Wayne's band was well rehearsed. Tom Elam, the trumpet player, all these guys, Joe Lano on the guitar,
Sure. Oh my goodness, he was wonderful. I remember when we lived on Pama, we would have big parties, and the band that was Wayne Newton's would come over to the parties, and they would bring his bandstand. We'd have like a whole thing going on our backyard. And so one day Wayne says, well, at least if you're going to use my band and use my equipment, you can invite me to come to one of these.
Yeah, so. He was philanthropic. He did a lot for the community.
Yeah, nice stuff.
Big act. Well, I think we've used up 2 hours. I can't believe it.